reading about how God really emphasizes the second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. He emphasizes things like justice. He emphasizes mercy. He emphasizes compassion and generosity and sacrifice and hospitality. Those are some of the biggest things that we see throughout the Old and New Testament. And I just think, you know what? If I started out with the Bible, if I just looked at it and said, okay, if I picked up a Bible and I imagined what followers of Jesus would look like, if I understood what the church would look like and how worship would really be, what conclusion would I come up with? Would I come up with a weekly assembly of mere just sitting here on a Sunday and worshiping God and listening to me talk for an hour and then going out? Or do we actually see it as one that has a yearning and a longing in our hearts so much that we see the brokenness in people's lives as Christ saw brokenness in our lives? And He did something about it. That we look at people, we actually do something about it. Do we get heartbroken that there's immorality existing and we have the ability to stand up and say, you know what, we need to do something about it? When we see hurting people in their lives, do we step aside and walk the other way and pretend it's not happening, that we didn't see it, so we don't think we're accountable? Or will we be like the Good Samaritan and stop and actually do something? The more I read through the Old and New Testament, the more I realize that God is actually a God of justice, and He wants us to care. Oftentimes we use religion as a source of a way to make ourselves look better than we really are, to cover up greed and indifference. But the kind of religion that God has called us to have is one that will consider and think about others. Religion, by biblical definition, means paying homage and worship to God. And the kind of worship and service that God wants, and He clarifies this over and over again throughout the Old and New Testament, is that He wants worship to Him by our service to one another. And this is, the more I'm learning about this and studying it, the more I'm recognizing it, the more I realize we have to care about other people, and we have to do something about it. And one of the things that I see over and over again is we read in things like Luke chapter 10. Are we like the Good Samaritan? Because in that, Jesus clarifies who our neighbor is, and He clarifies what it means to love your neighbor. And here we have a Good Samaritan. He had no obligation. He had no emotional connection. He had no relation to this man, this Jewish man who would have probably hated him if he wasn't injured. Yet the Good Samaritan helped him out. And when Jesus taught the Pharisee this lesson about who this Good Samaritan is and what it means to be a good neighbor, He tells them, go and do likewise. Go and be merciful. This is the lesson of what I'm trying to help you understand what it means to love your neighbor. Showing mercy to the point where you're willing to stop and actually do what is moral and right. In James chapter 1, verse 27 that Willie read, he emphasized that pure religion that God finds acceptable is this one that cares for widows and orphans. We understand in Matthew chapter 25 that when we stand before judgment, one of the ways that God is actually going to test the faithfulness of our faith and the genuineness of our faith is actually in how we responded to other people, to the poor, to the needy, to our Christian brothers and sisters. Did we actually do something about it? Did our faith inspire and motivate and push us to do something that God has called us to do? Even the whole book of Amos, you think about that. A whole Old Testament book is written with the major theme about social injustice and social justice that should be done by God's people. And when you read throughout the book of Amos, he indicts the people of God's people, and Amos is proclaiming, you guys are devaluing people. Even to the price of sandals, you'll sell out people for money. You don't care about the needy. You don't care about the poor. You just fatten yourselves up. You indulge yourself. And that's what you think your life is all about. It's all about you and what you want and other people serving you. That's not what God wants. But then on the flip side, I also see that there's this thing where people often try to worship God and they have this false sense of worship and these worship acts, but God makes known, guess what? All those things don't matter to me if you don't do what is right as well. One of the things that we see in Micah, the 6th chapter, is that God makes very clear, I'm not impressed by extravagant worship. I'm not impressed by all your sacrifice to me if your heart isn't right. You know what? Sometimes we come to worship service, we can feel emotionally moved. I can even make you cry at times, and you can feel all good and warm and fuzzy, or you'll feel broken and like, yeah, I need to do what God wants me to do, and then we'll leave it at that. You see, that's not worship service. That's not how our emotional state should actually push us to do what is actually morally right and biblical in God's sight in view of who God is. And what he makes known in Micah, the 6th chapter, is that beyond extravagant worship, the things that he actually looks for is humility, mercy, and justice. That's not to negate acts of worship. That's not to negate worship at all, because we are to do those things as well. But he's saying, you can't have legitimate worship to me if you neglect those things. Because he prioritizes us showing justice and mercy and humility to one another more than just hearing us sing praises to God. That's one of the amazing things about God. God would care more about us helping each other than us just sitting in a room praising him. And that's a hard thing, because God is a God of social justice. He's a God who cares about the needs of people. I also read in Matthew the 23rd chapter, when we read about people who kept the law, people who knew their Bible, people who did a lot of worship acts and religious acts, and even were generous at points, and they fasted all the time. In Matthew 23, Jesus indicts them for all their religious acts and makes known they're worthless. And not only are they worthless, but it really offends me. It's vain worship, and it's a woe to you. But then he makes known what he really wanted. He said, you do all these traditions, you fulfill all these laws, but in reality, what you actually neglected was justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Once again, Jesus is emphasizing the same thing that we're reading in this Old Testament passages, is that he's emphasizing we need to show what is just. We need to be moral. We need to do what is right. And always showing mercy, that we look at people and we say, you know what, their suffering is not right, and I got to do something about it. I mean, God didn't bless us to use our blessings on ourselves, but to actually do what he has called us to do. And God purposed us to do good works. And we think about Ezekiel 16, verse 49. Here's a major one. You think of Sodom, the great sinful city that was sexually immoral. But here Ezekiel even makes known the sin of Sodom was their indulgence, their pride, and their indifference. And they did not help the poor and needy. Here, these people were not even God's chosen people, but God still expected them to do what is moral and right, and wanted justice and care for the poor and needy. And I just think that's amazing. That God cares so much that that's what he expects from all of us, because we're mankind. We should care for one another. And because we're followers of Jesus, we should care even more so. This is one of the reasons why when I see Christians grow, I can tell when Christians are growing, because they start thinking outside of themselves and they're doing things for other people that they would have not otherwise done. They serve people in ways that they would not have served. They have given in ways that they would have been able to bless themselves with. But that's where I see growth, and that's what excites me, is that they don't do it because of this, well, God wants me to and commands me to, and I have to do it begrudgingly. Because God wants cheerful givers. He wants people who do so out of joy and a love for God. And when I love God, when I grow in love for God, the more I look at people and I say, I love you more too. The more I grow in love for you, the more I actually also grow in love for God. It has this connected relationship. You see, I read throughout the New Testament and I read throughout the Old Testament, I see more and more about how God cares for justice and mercy and service. And I just think, you know what? Service and mercy are two of the spiritual gifts of the church. And I think even one of the first ministries of the church was providing for widows in the church. And I often think, you know what? Oftentimes in the church we emphasize the spiritual over the physical, in a sense we should. But sometimes we neglect the physical as well. But James also makes the point, when you neglect the physical, you're also neglecting the spiritual. And if you don't even care about people's clothing and their hungry bellies and things, but you just say, I'll pray for you, I care about your spiritual life, then what good is your religion? If you won't even care for that which is less important than that, then how can you care about the spiritual, which is even more important? And that's one of the things that he emphasizes. And when I think about the church, I think, you know what? What's the best way that we could utilize our time? What's the best way we could utilize our money? What's the best way? And that really is